We're joined today by Dr. Mark Liddiard, who is a senior lecturer in social policy at Curtin University. And we're discussing universal basic income, which is a concept that's been gaining momentum in some parts of the world. So how does a universal basic income work?
Thanks, Ken. This is a very interesting idea. The idea has been around for a long time, and it's garnered support from both the left and the right of the political spectrum. Milton Friedman, for example, and Charles Murray, who were both key architects of Thatcherism and Reaganism, they're supporters of a universal basic income. So it's not just the usual suspects. In a nutshell, the idea is that every citizen is given a basic obligation-free living wage to meet their living costs. And what that then means is that if you don't want to work, you don't necessarily have to work. So that's one of the kind of more interesting kind of features of this. But the rationale, which it sounds a little bit counterintuitive, the rationale behind this is to resolve disincentives to work. Because we know that in the Australian welfare state, like many international welfare states, has an issue with welfare tapers. And what that means is that the loss of welfare income for each dollar that's earned in the labour market can often be steep enough to ensure that work doesn't pay or effectively pay so little extra for a full week of work that it discourages job seekers. So that's the key rationale behind this. And the idea really is that those who want to work keep the income that they earn in addition to their basic income. So that's one of the kind of key features here. The other key feature is about reducing cost of administration. We know that in Australia, the cost of administering Centrelink is around about $3 billion. And we know that welfare states internationally tend to become incrementally more and more complex as changes are made over time. So the cost of administration of welfare and simplifying that is another key benefit. Because I think one of the reasons why this has begun to attract quite a lot of interest in Europe at the moment is to do with the idea of using a universal basic income to generate consumption. And on the back of that, to generate economic growth, because we know that deflation is presenting some pretty serious challenges both to Europe and Australia is seeing signs of deflation as well. So the question is how to best address that, because we know that low interest rates have had a fairly kind of limited impact, and more unconventional approaches, monetary approaches like quantitative easing, have similarly not necessarily had the effect of generating the economic growth that was initially hoped. So it's part of that suite of policy responses in terms of how to generate economic growth through consumption.
So where has this been trialled and what impact has been seen?
It's interesting that the plan at the moment is to trial this next year in Finland. And that's going to be the first time that this has been trialled. It's a relatively small trial, about 10,000 individuals. And they're going to be given a basic income of around about $800 a month. And so there's a lot of interest in terms of seeing how Finland go with this. There are a number of aspects of the Finnish welfare system that make its applicability to Australia more difficult to see. So we know that Finland, like many Scandinavian welfare states, has various forms of provision, childcare provision, for example, that's free at the point of access. And that's rather different to the Australian context, where we have a much more privatised welfare system. So it will be interesting to see what happens in Finland, but even if it proves to be a success, I think there's some interesting questions about how readily that can be applied to Australia. And we also know that the Dutch are looking at this, particularly in the city of Utrecht. And I think it was last week that Switzerland voted on this. Switzerland actually rejected a universal basic income for a number of reasons. The issue of immigration, which is quite an interesting one here, the issue of immigration proved to be one of the key stumbling blocks here. So that's where we're at the moment. The idea has been around for a long time. It's very much kind of utopian idea, but we are now moving from the concept to actually seeing how this works in practice. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens, particularly with the Finnish trials next year.
So are there any key misconceptions in this debate?
I suppose one misconception, and it's part of unpicking the idea, because on the face of it, it sounds quite peculiar. What benefits are there to be had from letting the idle live in uninterrupted idleness? But one of the key selling points, I suppose, is the idea that with a universal basic income, the strivers, those that want to go out and work, either gain employment or set up their own business or set up their own market store, they get enough to live on and also get to keep whatever else they earn, while those that don't want to work, they don't starve, but they're nonetheless tangibly worse off. And what we're seeing in Europe and internationally at the moment is that that's proven to be quite attractive. So this idea that everyone just gets the same income and that's that is rather misleading. That isn't the case at all. I think some of the problems with universal basic income, the obvious problem is set-up costs. And the modelling here varies. Estimates vary between about 1% and 3% of GDP. A number of estimates suggest the cost of setting this up is around about 1% of GDP, which is around about $150 billion. And of course, without a clear sense of the benefits that flow from that, it's quite difficult then to see policymakers adopting this kind of model. And certainly the UK, at the moment, the opposition parties in the UK are looking at this. And they're interested in something of a hybrid model, which is a mix of universal basic income with existing welfare system in the UK. And one of the reasons why they're adopting a hybrid or thinking of adopting a hybrid model is to do with the implementation costs and the cost of actually setting it up. So there's a number of kind of challenges here, and how you set the level as well is another rather interesting challenge, because we know that inflation has been one of the challenges with the idea of a universal basic income. In other words, if you give everyone $1 million, then the value of what you can then buy in terms of goods and services for $1 million changes. And so that historically has been a real challenge with universal basic income. But given the spectre of deflation that we're presented with globally, that's, as I said earlier, that's one of the reasons why there is growing interest in this. But nonetheless, how you set that level is quite interesting. And there's some suggestions that you can almost, in the same way that interest rates are used to almost kind of control economic growth by either raising interest rates or dropping interest rates. The idea is the level of a universal basic income could almost be set in the same way, determined by what's happening with inflation and what's happening with employment. So there are a number of kind of challenges here, and I think in the Australian context, one of the key challenges is attitudes, the notion of conditionality. And we see that very much in the narrative of lifters and leaners that has been instrumental in selling welfare reform in Australia. Although nonetheless it's interesting that public attitudes in Australia are nonetheless broadly supportive of more rather than less public spending. We know that about 3/4 of Australians would like to see more spent on health, more spent on education. Around about 40% would still like to see more spent on welfare benefits. So there are a number of challenges, I think, with universal basic income and actually implementing that in Australia.
Do you think this is something that could be implemented in Australia?
To be honest, in the near future, I think it's highly unlikely that we're likely to see this implemented in Australia. But we are looking at some interesting changes in terms of contemporary labour markets. And certainly the Dutch debate, there's been an author called Rutger Bregman who's been very influential in the Dutch debate about universal basic incomes. And he makes the point, which is a very interesting point, that in the 21st century we're seeing some quite dramatic changes to labour markets. We're seeing the growth of underemployment. We're seeing ongoing debates really about how long the working week and the working day should be. And in fact, this year we've seen Sweden introduce a 6-hour working day for exactly these reasons, not least because the evidence suggests that 6-hour working days are actually more productive than 8-hour working days. And so the increasing kind of mechanisation of labour markets and these kind of broader changes to contemporary labour markets suggest that this idea is not going to go away, and it may be that over a period of time it's looked at more seriously by mainstream policymakers, as is the case in Europe. So it's interesting that just over the past couple of years there's been much more kind of interest in this than there was. So I think immediately I think implementation in Australia is unlikely. But I can see that there is growing interest in this, both in Australia and internationally.
Thank you for your time today.
You're very welcome. Thank you.